Now, what kind of things make a difference for how much people are spending? And again, the big credit crunch of 2007, 2008 is a very good example of what happens to determine these things. One of the biggest things is confidence. If people think that things are going to get worse, if people think that they might lose their jobs, they stop spending because they need to have the money in the bank in case they are made redundant. The trouble is, if people stop spending and they're not spending any money, it means that other people will be made redundant. It almost becomes a vicious circle. So the idea is, I'm worried about losing my job, so I don't spend anything. Because I don't spend anything, a person in a shop loses their job. So if they lose their job, they can't spend anything, and the whole thing gets worse and worse and worse. Confidence is incredibly important when you're talking about economic stuff. Aggregate demand. What's the total demand in the entire country? Look at all the workers together. Look at businesses, workers, governments, and how much do all of them together actually want to buy? Do we want that to go up? Do we want it to come down? Supply finance, and this again is another big problem that there's been in the credit crunch. People need to borrow money in order to expand. It could be me wanting to buy a bigger house. It could be me wanting to have a new car. Both of those in effect mean I'm going to expand. A bigger house, a bigger car, it's something new. For a company, it's investment. They need to invest for the future, to do things in the future. Now, the trouble is, if they can't borrow the money, which is what's going on in the credit crunch, they can't expand, which means they're stuck with what they've got at the moment. They can't buy anything new, which means demand will go down. So again, those two are very big problems in 2007, 2008. Factors of production. We've already talked about things like labour. One of the biggest things that affects the economy is, do your labourers, does your workforce have the right skills? 50, 60 years ago, a lot of manufacturing companies were around that needed skilled labour. Now, one of the biggest skills that people need is things like IT. 50 years ago, nobody had heard of IT. So it's a big skill that has had to be developed. Some countries have developed it very strongly and will be successful. Some countries haven't and will be less successful. So can you develop the skills of your workforce? That can be particularly important, for example, for a small country. So a small country may be relying, for example, on something like agriculture. So its main factor of production is its land. Well, the trouble is that agriculture is not going to get you very far. You perhaps need to develop other skills in your workforce so that they can do things that the modern society wants. So things like becoming more IT literate. Government policy, again, spending, expanding, contracting, what are they doing? And exchange rate movements, again, fit in with things like foreign exchange. What is happening to our currency? Getting stronger? Getting weaker. Both of those present problems in different ways. There's an awful lot of things that go on that actually affect what happens with the economy. Now, as I say, you're not expected in this paper to understand all of them. All we're trying to do is to just have an introduction to them, just so we are vaguely aware of what's happening. Best way, to be honest with you, to study for this is just to read a paper. Once a week, have a look at what they're talking about with the state of the economy, because they'll probably explain how all these things fit together. So that's just a good little tip. Final thing we've got in this chapter, I did tell you there wasn't a lot in it, the economic cycle. For some reason, the economy tends to go through times that are good and times that are bad. And to a certain extent, all governments can try and do is smooth this out a little bit. They can't really prevent it from happening. So what a government might try and do is, you can see here, we have a recession where things are getting bad, a depression where they are very seriously bad, a recovery and a boom. So things get better and then they get really good, and then they just go round again. There will be a recession, depression and so on. These things tend to come round about every 10, 15 years. The job of a government is really to try and do that. They can't really present good times and bad times. They can just try and make the bad times not as bad. And hopefully, if the bad times aren't as bad, that often means that the good times aren't quite as good. The better the good time, often the worse the recession that comes after it. So, impact of economic issues on all these things. What happens as we move through this economic cycle? It means that unemployment will go up and down. Inflation will go up and down. And as I've already said, those two often tend to go in opposite directions to each other. High unemployment, low inflation. People don't have jobs, there isn't a demand for products. High employment, high inflation. So governments try and balance those two. Stagnation is, unfortunately, where you have both. Where you've got high unemployment and you've also got high inflation. That was a situation quite common around the world in the 1970s. So that's a very, very serious situation to get into. Growth. Obviously, we would like to have economic growth. We would like things to get better. But again, without letting them get too good too quickly. Because if they get too good too quickly, they will get bad very quickly. So try and make things a bit more stable. And finally, balance of payments disequilibrium, which is a horrible word. But again, it simply means, do we have a surplus? Do we have a deficit? That's all. Now again, the kind of things to think about in the exam, the way that the examiner will test this is he'll simply say, look, what are these things? What do we mean by the balance of payments? It's the money coming into the country and the money that goes out of the country. He'll talk about there is a company or a country with high inflation, what else might they have? So again, it's all going to be relatively straightforward stuff. Read a paper to see what goes on in real life. That's probably more use than reading a textbook, to be perfectly honest with you. So the idea then is the company, in an exam, a company needs to be aware of where we are in the macroeconomic cycle. For example, if we are at that point there has been a boom, we are going into recession. The company has to plan ahead. Things are going to get worse. It will get harder to borrow money. So if you've got any long-term projects that you are thinking about doing, getting the finance is going to become more difficult. So you may have to put things off. It is going to get harder to get and to keep customers. So you may have to think about how that's going to affect your workforce, how it's going to affect your budgets, how it's going to affect your prices. You may need to think about, various plans that you've got for what you would like to do. Maybe we'd like to expand abroad. Maybe that isn't going to happen. Maybe we were going to buy another company. Maybe that's not going to happen. So there's lots of impacts if we have a business there are lots of impacts if we have an economy that's going into a recession. Just as similarly as there's lots of impacts if we've got a business and an economy that's coming out of a recession. Things are going to get easier, and the people who recognise it first tend to be the ones that do very well. So the whole idea behind all of this is we need to look at the outside world. We can't plan our business and ignore everything else.